Once again, we are in Maui, and I'm sorry to say it's beautiful. Um, Today's topic is a very important one and very relevant to what's going on today with a lot of legislation that's pending in various states. The topic is voter suppression, then and now, and I'm going to turn this over to Sue.
Well, just give me 1 minute and I will get my recalcitrant computer to work here. Hold on.
And Sue, you'll need to go to speaker view.
You would think I would have done this enough that it would be no problem. All right, here we go. So I am grateful for this opportunity to share this time with you as together we explore racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. Today we focus on part 5 of 6, voter suppression, then and now. As we've traced the chronological history of our country from its founding through the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century, we've seen glimpses of concerted efforts to suppress the voting power of non-white people. Today, we will focus explicitly on the right to vote as the foundation of our democracy and the extraordinary efforts that have been expended and are intensifying to this day to prevent these citizens from achieving meaningful representation. A brief recap from last week, mass incarceration and the war on drugs. We looked at some of the significant legislative actions that imposed the war on drugs, the law enforcement incentives and the militarization of law enforcement that were collateral consequences. The fact that in terms of mass incarceration, with the United States having less than 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners, we lead the world in those statistics. And our process of mass incarceration has had a disproportionate impact on people of color, so that today, our country's criminal justice system is truly racialized at every stage. So today we turn to voter suppression, then and now. We're going to begin by taking a look at a historical framework for voting rights in our country, and then the path to representation for African Americans following the Civil War. Then we'll take a look at the adaptive tactics of the white majority to suppress the Black vote, tactics that went on for nearly 100 years until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then we'll take a look at the current assault. So we begin by looking at the Declaration of Independence, a foundational statement written by Thomas Jefferson that says governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. And so the power of our government comes from the consent of those being governed, and that consent is given through the vote. Within the Constitution, there's only one clause that speaks to voting, and it says the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but Congress may at any time make or alter such regulations except as to the place of choosing senators. Once we look at the full Constitution and all its amendments, as we move beyond the first 10 amendments of the bill that make up the Bill of Rights, we find that nearly a third of the constitutional amendments deal with voting. We have already talked about the 14th Amendment, which provided citizenship and due process to those formerly enslaved. The 15th Amendment declared that these individuals were citizens and that all races had the right to vote. Well, all men in all races had the right to vote. It took until 1920, 1920, with the passage of the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote. Then in 1961, the 23rd Amendment enabled residents of the District of Columbia to vote for president and vice president, but they have no voting representation in Congress. The 24th Amendment in 1964 outlawed the poll tax. And the 26th Amendment, passed in 1971, concurrent with our participation in the Vietnam War, reduced the voting age from 21 to 18. So aspects of voting have played a key role in amending the Constitution over our country's history. Interestingly, it was not until 1924 that the Snyder Act declared that Native Americans could be citizens of the United States. That should have given them the right to vote, but many states continued to restrict the rights of Native Americans to vote. But no Native American was considered a citizen of this country until 1924. And so we come to 1965 and the passage of the landmark Voting Rights Act. So the path to enfranchisement of African Americans began in 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves, sort of, as we know. The 14th Amendment in 1868 gave the rights of citizenship and due process to those formerly enslaved, and then that should have been sufficient to enable them to vote, but it required yet another amendment in 1870, the 15th Amendment, that declared the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so, with the passage of that amendment, there was ostensibly representation at last, the opportunity for the formerly enslaved men to give their consent to be governed. And in fact, that year, a little over 500,000 Black men registered to vote. And in that election, the turnout among that population was more than 90%. 600 state legislators who were African American were elected, 18 state executives, 18 US congressmen, and 2 senators. And they worked to help craft laws on charitable and penal institutions, on finance, and on public schools. But the white backlash began. And so violence as voter suppression appeared. In 1865, the Ku Klux Klan had been founded in Pulaski, Tennessee, and it began taking on an ever more important role in the suppression of voting. You may recall seeing the video that reflected the number of lynchings that occurred in the southern states during Reconstruction, 1865 to 1876, while federal troops were present in the South in order to maintain order. Of those, virtually every year, there were a series of lynchings that specifically targeted people who were voting or who were registering to vote or who were helping people register to vote. We often have thought of lynchings associated with inappropriate behavior of specifically Black men toward white women or other forms of social contract infractions. But these mass lynchings were all focused at sending the message that Blacks were not to vote. And as we've already covered, in 1876, the election between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes resulted in a non-decision. And as a consequence, the Supreme Court and Congress worked out a compromise whereby Rutherford B. Hayes would be named president if he would agree to end Reconstruction. And in fact, during that election period, Blacks were brutally targeted as they stood in line to vote, went to vote, talked about voting, helped others vote. And as a consequence, the federal troops were withdrawn from the South and Reconstruction came to an end. Then beginning in 1890, the Southern states began holding constitutional conventions to make sure that those formerly enslaved and their descendants would be disenfranchised. The Mississippi Plan in 1890 required that in order to vote, potential voters must be Mississippi residents for 2 years, pay an annual poll tax, and pass an elaborate literacy test. Every Southern state followed suit in passing similar legislation. Within the Mississippi Plan was something called the Grandfather Clause. And the Grandfather Clause fundamentally said that if your grandfather voted before 1865, then you were eligible to register to vote. And of course, that didn't apply to any of the African Americans in the country. And so if that didn't allow you to vote, to register, then you had to go through the elaborate process of paying poll tax and passing literacy tests. The poll taxes were difficult for all poor people to pay, but the tax was sometimes forgiven for white individuals seeking to register, not so for African Americans. And the literacy test was much more stringent for African Americans seeking to vote. There were portions of state constitutions deliberately written to be incomprehensible, and those were the sections of the Constitution selected by the election examiner for the potential Black voter to read and interpret. And again, we know that at least through 1865, it was against the law in virtually every state in the South for Blacks to learn to read or write. And so the impact on registration was such that those numbers went from 90% of the eligible voters to 6% in 1892. Louisiana was even more draconian and made it quite clear, explicitly clear, that their purpose was to enshrine white supremacy and make sure that Black citizens did not have the right to vote. And so in Louisiana, registered Black voter numbers dropped from more than 130,000 in 1898 to 1,342 by 1904. And by 1910, no Southern Black citizens could vote. And if you think about it, all of the representatives and senators elected in the coming decades who created programs like the GI Bill and the Federal Housing Administration, there was no consent of the governed. There was no representation of the Black population in the South. And indeed, by 1940, only 3% of Southern Blacks could vote. One of the other tactics that was employed to keep African Americans out of the political process, the Democratic Party in many states adopted a rule excluding them from party membership. And in a Supreme Court decision in 1921, Newbery v. United States, the court ruled that political parties were private organizations and not part of the government election apparatus. And so it was perfectly legal to deny Blacks the right to be members of a political party. As time went on, excuse me, But as time went on, there were other judgments made that said that Blacks could be members of parties, political parties. But the Democratic Party then began instituting what were known as white primaries. And so they would say that only white members of the party could vote in the primary elections. And of course, it was pretty much one party rule in the South with the Democrats in charge. So whoever was nominated as a result of the primary became the de facto, not just candidate, but representative or senator. And so finally in 1944, the Supreme Court said, no, you really can't have those white primaries. That really violates due process. And so Texas Democrats established a private association from which African Americans were excluded, and then they held pre-primary elections that named the candidates who were then to be offered for voting in the primaries. And those pre-primary all-white elections continued until 1953. At the same time, intimidation continued. Outright lynchings, but also threats of violence. This is an image from the Miami Herald in 1940, making it clear, yet again, the risks that were taken if you were bold enough to think that you wanted to cast your vote. At the same time, many in the South were part of the sharecropper economic system where you rented land and farmed it and had an economic relationship with your landlord. But when Blacks during this time period were found to register to vote, their names were listed in the newspaper, and then their landlord would take action to evict them from their sharecropping farms. And an evicted sharecropper typically had nowhere to go. So in 1960, 1,400 African Americans registered to vote in Fayette County, Tennessee, and 700 of them were evicted. White landowners in Greene County, Alabama evicted at least 75 Black families in 1960, and more than 40 Black families were evicted in Lowndes County, Alabama in 1965 alone. Many evicted families were forced to live in tent cities that sprang up throughout the South. These were communities where people lived in tents year-round, and white segregationist night riders would ride through these tent cities, firing weapons and terrorizing the residents, making sure that no one was bold enough to decide to vote. And so this and a whole range of other legislation passed and extra-legal prohibitions against voting led Congress to conclude that this overwhelming resistance to enforcing the 15th Amendment required congressional action. And so in 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, said to be the most significant piece of civil rights legislation ever passed by Congress. The key section, Section 2, was language that closely followed that of the 15th Amendment, saying that the right to vote could not be denied to these individuals. And Section 4 contained a formula for identifying jurisdictions that had a history of significant racial discrimination. And so that was 9 states, a number of counties, and a number of cities were specifically identified as having a lengthy history of disenfranchising Black voters. The act also provided that Congress could update and rewrite that formula to change the jurisdictions that the Voting Rights Act covered as time went on. And then Section 5 listed the specific targeted areas as of the passage of the law. And the law said that there could be no change to voting rules without pre-clearance from the Federal Department of Justice. It also provided that the Voting Rights Act must be renewed every 5 years. And so in 1970, Congress renewed it for 5 years. In 1975, renewed it for 7 years, and they updated Section 4 to adjust changes in the jurisdictions that needed to be covered. Then in 1982, Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act for 25 years. It came up yet again for renewal in 2006, and Congress overwhelmingly reauthorized the Voting Rights Act for another 25 years. The vote was 390 to 33 in the House, and it was unanimous in the Senate. But in 2013, Shelby County, Alabama, filed a lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court. And it was decided that Section 4 was unconstitutional. It was struck down, and so those 9 states, the counties and municipalities, were removed from the pre-clearance requirement. Within 8 hours, Texas instituted a voter ID law that had previously been blocked through pre-clearance on the Voting Rights Act. North Carolina reduced its early voting locations across the state from 16 to 1. Alabama closed the DMV offices that were the source of voter IDs in 8 of the 10 counties where Black citizens made up more than 75% of the population. So between 1982 and 2006, that prior 25-year period, the Department of Justice had blocked 700 discriminatory voting changes. And all of that was undone by the Supreme Court decision of 2013. And now we turn to the current assault. And we begin with the myth of voter fraud, because it is indeed a myth. In fact, there have been no comprehensive studies ever done to show significant systemic voter fraud, even before the 2020 election. In fact, a constitutional law scholar by the name of Justin Levitt at Loyola University undertook a study of voting between 2000 and 2014, and he looked at 1 billion votes. And in doing this, he found 36 credible possible cases of voter fraud. Not proven, just credibly possible. But as a consequence of this myth, a range of states began imposing voter ID laws. Before 2006, in the United States, you did not need an ID to vote anywhere. But beginning at this point in time, beginning in 2006, states began implementing these laws. A couple of examples. Alabama issues government photo IDs to every resident of public housing in the state. Those IDs are not sufficient as a voter ID. You need another one, a different one. In Georgia, you are required to get an ID from the Department of Motor Vehicles, but in the 2 counties in Atlanta, where more than 75% of the residents were African American, there were no, the DMVs were closed. And almost 64% of those African Americans had no vehicle and had to find a way to get transportation to another county, to a DMV, to get an ID. In Indiana, there has not been a single instance of voter fraud in the state's history. And there's a law that a birth certificate is required in order to get a driver's license or a state ID. But if you need a copy of your birth certificate, you have to have a driver's license or a state ID to get it. North Carolina was instructive. The North Carolina Board of Elections did an extraordinary review of election returns, analyzed almost 5 million votes in 2016, and they found one case of voter ID fraud. But the legislature gathered information on what are the kinds of IDs that white people are likely to have, and what are the kind of IDs that Black people are likely to have. And then they crafted a law that required an ID that a white person was likely to have, and none of the ones that a Black person was likely to have. In fact, the Fourth Circuit judge who heard an appeal of that case ruled that the law had been targeted at African Americans with almost surgical precision. In North Dakota, the legislature passed a law that said your ID must have a street address in order to qualify for you to be able to vote. But Native Americans living on reservations don't have street addresses. They have post office boxes, and so their IDs don't qualify. And in Texas, they eliminated enough Department of Motor Vehicle offices that in those counties that were predominantly had the higher proportion of Black citizens, some cases it would require a 250-mile round trip to get to the nearest Department of Motor Vehicles in order to get your ID. And in Texas, if you had a concealed weapon permit, that qualified you to vote, but a student ID did not. At the same time, states began purging voters from rolls. The National Voting Registration Act prohibits purging voter rolls just because someone didn't vote. And yet that's exactly what they did. And that continued all the way up through the 2020 election. Millions of voters were purged from voter ID rolls as a consequence. There was a program called Crosscheck that was created by Chris Kobach in Kansas. And it was a program that looked to see if there were a duplicate voting registrations in multiple states. And it did it based on, did first and last name and date of birth match? Well, you would think that wouldn't be very many, but it turns out that there are hundreds of thousands of cases of matches when that's what you look at. And so in 2012, Iowa used the Crosscheck program, and they got a list of 240,000 names that ostensibly were people who were also registered to vote in another state. And when they went through the laborious process of checking it out, they found that there were 6 people who were actually the same person registered to vote in 2 states. Ultimately, the Crosscheck program was abandoned, but in the meantime, it had resulted in significant purging of voter rolls. At the same time, there was a great deal of work to deprive minority precincts of resources. In Florida, limited early voting times meant that there would be 4 to 5 hour waits in order to vote. In Indiana, counties with more than 325,000 people only got 1 early voting site, unless there was unanimous agreement among the bipartisan election board members, and there never was. In North Carolina, again, the limitations on early voting stations meant 5, 6, 7, 8 hour waiting times. And in Ohio, there was 1 polling station per county, regardless of population. And we've all seen the lines of people waiting to vote. And then there are the people who simply can't or won't stand in those lines in order to make their voices heard. And then Florida in 2000, election officials took a look at 2000 and saw that 16% of registered voters in the state were Black, and that was up from 10% in the 1996 election. And so they devised a laptop program that would be, that would enable people at polling places throughout the state to be able to log into the Tallahassee database. If someone showed up to vote and for some reason their name wasn't on the local voter registration rolls, they could use the laptop, they could sign into the Tallahassee database. And those laptops were provided to all of the predominantly white counties in Florida and only one predominantly Black precinct in the state. And so for the rest, if someone showed up and their name wasn't on the voter registration roll, an election official had to call Tallahassee on the phone to see if that person actually should be registered to vote. And even more significantly, I think we remember the hanging chads and the issues around the 2000 election. The whiter counties received modern optical scanners, and the predominantly Black counties had the punch card system that had the higher rate of rejected ballots. And further, sort of a lynching redux, Republican ballot integrity programs installed observers at largely Black precinct voting locations. And those agents, sometimes aided by local police, would warn Black people seeking to vote that even an innocent technical error on their registration information, such as a bad address or zip code, could subject them to arrest. And often, these Black citizens seeking to vote were photographed by these agents, putting further pressure on them in the context of potential subsequent legal action. So intimidation in yet another form. At the same time, we have the issue of felon voting rights. There are 2 states in America where you can vote from jail, Maine and Vermont. In 14 other states and the District of Columbia, you lose the right to vote while you are incarcerated, but that right to vote is automatically restored when you return to the community. In 21 states, you lose your rights during incarceration and typically during parole and probation. And in 13 states, you lose your right to vote indefinitely. It requires a governor's pardon for you to be able to regain your right to vote. Now, in the state of Delaware, there's a lot of work going on with criminal justice reform, and a lot of that has to do with people formerly incarcerated. It used to be called felons, ex-convicts. The term today is returning citizen, a reminder that these are indeed citizens. And the issue is not what they were, it is what they are now. They are returning to their communities, to society. They are citizens and should have the right to vote. You may recall that last year, Florida had a referendum that passed that allowed formerly convicted felons who were released from prison to be able to vote. It passed by about a 2/3 majority. But the legislature then enacted a law that said, not so fast. If you owe any money at all as part of your sentence, you must pay all fines and fees and costs before you can vote. Sort of reminiscent of a poll tax, but the court said it's not, because it's not categorized as a tax. It's a fee or a fine. Yet another assault comes in the form of gerrymandering, where representation districts are carved out in order to create a predetermined result. In Wisconsin, the state elections, Democrats won 52% of the vote, and that translated to 39% of the seats. In North Carolina, Republicans won 50% of the vote, and that translated to 77% of the seats in the state legislature. The other thing that happens is that it creates these safe districts where there is no opponent, which significantly compromises the ability for people to make informed, intelligent decisions about who is to represent them. And then, of course, we have the 2020 elections and all the claims of voter fraud and malfeasance. And so today, the assault accelerates. 43 states have seen 253 bills introduced so far to restrict voting. If they were enacted, it would create the greatest contraction of voting rights since that period following Reconstruction in the 1800s. A significant number of these laws deal with early and absentee voting. In 2020, 158.4 million votes were cast in total. 116 million of those were early or absentee votes. And in the 33 states that now have proposed legislation limiting early and absentee voting, 85 million people in those 33 states voted using one of those forms during the 2020 election. And so we've heard a lot about Georgia and the legislation that is being proposed there. One of the more recent ones being it is a crime to offer water to people who are standing in line waiting to vote. And I had an example in Alabama and it's just gone right out of my mind. Anyway, 43 states are considering laws that would limit voting, constrict ballot access. And there has been reporting that said that a number of these bills have been introduced to demonstrate Republican allegiance to the myth of voter fraud and stolen election results, with the expectation that they wouldn't go anywhere, but they have. And now these representatives are being forced to make a decision on whether to vote for a restrictive voting act that would appeal to those in their party, but have the potential to be damaging in a general election. Too bad for them. So what could help in all of this? Automatic voter registration could help. Independent districting commissions. It's not the function of the majority of the legislature as the consequence of each 10-year census. Make Election Day a national holiday. If the 4th of July is a national holiday, what is more American or patriotic than voting? Enforce the National Voting Rights Act that said it is illegal to purge voter registration rolls just because someone didn't vote in a prior election. And restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in the format known as the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act. And then for each of us, knowing what's going on in our states and at the federal level, and become personal advocates for meaningful, equitable, effective change. At the federal level, the House of Representatives has passed H.R. 1 that deals with voting and elections and ethics. It awaits session action. It provides for standards for voter registration, automatic registration, mail-in ballots, standards. It allows for same-day registration, mandates up to a minimum of 15 days of early voting with hours that go beyond the 9 to 5 time period, prevents the purges of voter rolls that have been taking place, and restores voting rights to former felons. It provides for non-partisan redistricting commissions that would have 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 5 independents. And the process would allow for public comment and challenges to any redistricting that is done. campaign finance disclosures would require that super PACs and dark money disclose who their donors are, and that public funding would be provided to match small donor contributions. And that fund would come from fees that are imposed on corporations and banks for civil and criminal penalties. Ethics rules for public servants, specifically for Supreme Court justices, and it prevents the settlement of sexual assault, sexual harassment, and sexual discrimination charges against members of Congress. It would prevent them from using taxpayer funds to settle those sexual harassment and sexual discrimination charges. And finally, would require that presidential candidates make public their tax returns. So there's some questions here. Is voting a privilege or a right? Who should be able to vote? And what should the government's role be? To facilitate voting so that the consent of the governed is given, or to constrain voting?
Thank you, Sue. And those are very interesting and challenging questions. And for those of you who have done this before, down at the bottom of your screen is an area called reactions, and in that is a thumbs up button. And if you push that, I can call on you if you have a comment or a question or have an answer to one of Sue's questions. Jim Prendergast.
Got to unmute. Just a comment more than anything, just a perspective. I think that something that would be additive is the Citizens United decision to the whole. I think everything you laid out is phenomenal, Sue. But one of my big gripes or complaints is the amount of money that finds its way into elections, right? And how that skews processes, in my personal opinion, in an undemocratic way. That's my opinion. But when you look at that, and I probably don't remember Citizens United exactly, but I think the theme is that the Supreme Court said, listen, for the purposes of campaign finance, companies could be treated as individuals, which was a monumental decision. Whether you agree or not, I don't agree with it, truth in advertising, but whether you agree or not, that changed money in elections tremendously. And I think, just a reflection, I think that's another thing to add to the whole dialogue this week. It's relatively recent. It's not, centuries ago, but it certainly skews the process a lot when money is brought in just tremendous amounts into elections. So just a comment.
You're absolutely right, Jim, and that should be a point of emphasis here because it has had an enormous impact on campaign funding and certainly as a consequence on the results of elections. So I absolutely agree. Thank you. For future classes, I will add that. That is a pivotal item. Thank you.
Hank Smithies.
The thing that we often forget about the Citizens United decision from the court is it also included labor unions. Yes, big money is a problem in the elections, but we have to recognize that the action they're talking about is to affect the donations to one party, not both. If we're going to throw out contributions from big business, throw out contributions from labor unions.
Sure, I would assume that the goal would be to overturn Citizens United that allowed for all of those. The idea that a corporation should be treated as a person seems kind of antithetical to to what we would consider being appropriate. So yeah, Hank, I agree. It should be, in my view, it should be overturned in its entirety. It's not helpful for large sums of money to come from these organizations to influence our election results. I agree.
Martin and Michelle.
One thing, when we talk about corporations being treated as people, that is the idea of a corporation. It's kind of a legal fiction, but they all always get treated as people. But this was the first time that they said, we're going to treat them as people as far as voting is concerned.
Right.
And so the whole point of saying, well, okay, if we are going to treat them as people, and the reason why they were going to, they give money, and the reason why they're allowed to give money is it's freedom of speech. But the whole point is that they could hide behind the Citizens United and not divulge who they are. So if it is freedom of speech, then they have to be identified. But that's it's a big issue on that. But I agree. I don't like the fact that, first of all, that much money can go into influencing elections. And anytime there's a restriction on money, they say it's a restriction on speech, but that's another matter. But if it is speech, then the person should be identified. That's not the main issue I wanted to talk about. I just thought that since that came up, one thing I'd like to talk about is, this isn't the first time any of this has gone on, and Sue has documented that very well. But there was also, one of the things that I noticed that was missing was, there was actually a Civil Rights Act in 1875, okay? And that was the first Civil Rights Act. Now, what happened was, as you know, with all the electioneering going on during that time, that law was significantly weakened. And then on top of it, the Supreme Court made several interpretations to weaken that law. But I thought it was interesting that just this past week, Warnock made a speech on the floor, and he was talking about, as you guys know, Raphael Warnock, or Knock, was recently elected as senator for Georgia. And so he gave a speech talking about how we need to make sure that voting rights get upheld, and it could be at the cost of democracy itself. And what's so interesting is right during the 1875, several African-American elected officials made speeches almost exactly duplicate of Warnock just before the rights were taken away at the end of Reconstruction. So Sue, I have to applaud you on what you're saying. It's like we're trying to reenact Jim Crow.
Yep, it's Reconstruction Redux. Yep.
Yeah, and it's the Supreme Court, just like before.
Yep.
When Jim Crow was reenacted, it's like there were laws passed, and the Supreme Court overturns it.
Yep.
And so it's like history is just repeating itself.
Yes, indeed it is. It absolutely is. And the role of the Supreme Court in all of this has been extraordinary.
Yeah.
The list of decisions that boggle the mind just go on and on and on. We've highlighted a few, but it's sort of a miracle we've made it this far, kind of extraordinary. Thank you. Thank you, Martin.
Okay.
Anyone else?
Beverly?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I live in Pennsylvania, and it's pretty depressing because, as you recall, even after the insurrection, there were a number of members of the Pennsylvania House who stood up and objected to the outcome of the election. And it just, the comments long been made that Pennsylvania is Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Alabama in between. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that's true. Although my representative is Chrissy Houlihan, she's a Democrat, and Southern Chester County has recently swung Democratic. So there's hope down here, but the rest of the state, I don't know. It's just depressing. Anyway.
It is that. Carol, did you have your hand up?
There you go. Nope, it went back.
There you went.
Okay, do we
Yes.
get
Okay.
it this one? Okay, I was having trouble unmuting. I was wondering if you know at this point, say in this last election, what percentage of Black people voted? African Americans voted in the, because you had some statistics from way back when huge numbers voted, and then down to, maybe 6%. Are we at, anywhere near like 50% now, or do you have any idea?
I don't have those specific numbers. What I do know is that in the 2020 election, almost 67%, almost 2/3 of registered voters voted, which,
Okay.
and you may, I recall from years ago, and when I looked it up, it actually was in 88 and 96, that number barely eked past 50%. Because there had been a lot of talk about how are we doing all of this when only 50% of eligible voters are casting their votes. And so in the 2020 election, it was almost 67% of those eligible to vote cast their votes. I don't have that racial statistic at hand. I should, and it is available. It is available.
And I'm guessing, that I know that there was a big push to get the people in Georgia, to be able to register and to vote. Stacey Abrams and that whole group, the Fair Fight group, I guess, really worked very, very hard to make sure that people did get out and vote. And I'm wondering, on even a statewide basis, if we can see that really did have a big impact. I'm assuming it did in Georgia.
Yes, I'm assuming that it did in Georgia as well, especially given some of the restrictions that had been put in place by the legislature prior to that. But again, I don't have any specific numbers to provide.
I feel like I did donate some money to Stacey Abrams' organization, and I felt it was some of the best money that I spent. And I would like her to get involved in some more of these elections as well.
Well, and I think that, you go back to the Declaration of Independence. The power of government comes from the consent of the governed.
Right.
If you are limiting who can give their consent, then how is that representative democracy if a whole swath of the electorate is not represented?
Correct. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know if I'm still available.
Go right ahead.
60% of African Americans voted.
I'm sorry, what was the number?
60%.
60%.
Yes. So at least that's what it says in this one article that I have. What's interesting is I had a laptop. I kept those statistics and I had a laptop, but unfortunately the disk crashed. And so I would have been able to tell you exactly what it was, but but I knew that
Close
it was
enough. Yeah, thank you. Now remember, there's been 50 years where the Voting Rights Act was in effect. That's it. Out of
Right.
250 years of our history, for 200 years, there were constraints on African Americans, Black voting. 50 years where it was possible / encouraged. But you also have all this history that says voting is dangerous. I have family members, ancestors who were injured or killed trying to vote. And I'm going to vote, but I'm not going to vote for anybody who looks like me. There aren't any candidates that look like me. There aren't any candidates that represent what I think is important. So that 60%, if it's 67% of the electorate at large, the fact that it's 60% of African-American voters is probably a Herculean accomplishment given all this history, all this history.
Yeah.
Mickey?
Mickey,
Yes, I'm not sure. I think this is relevant. So I don't know. This week, someone gave me a printout of an article that was in Time magazine, written by Molly Ball. And it's called How Close We Came: The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the Election. And it's a fascinating read. And there were 6 pillars to their plan. And these were people, I won't go into it all, but who felt that the election was in danger and who had enough know-how and ability to organize this shadow campaign. And one of the pillars was the voting rights and encouraging civil rights groups to fight for ballot access, while Democratic lawyers fended off Trump allies' unprecedented volume of lawsuits. So I don't know if you're aware, I was not aware of this. I knew things that had happened because I watched the news, but I did not know that it was so organized. And
I was not aware of that, Mickey.
I would recommend this it's kind of a long article, but it's very enlightening and encouraging.
Thank you. Encouraging is good.
I almost felt, I don't know if thrill is too strong a word, but as I was reading it, almost felt a thrill that this strong thing was happening behind the scenes that we were not aware of.
Thank you. Beverly?
I just wanted to comment that I registered for a permanent mail-in ballot in Pennsylvania, and I got the form, and now I don't know what to do because I'm really concerned with the way the post office is going. And in Pennsylvania, as you'll recall, they weren't allowed to count the votes until election day. So even if you mailed in your ballot, and then there was all this fight about stopping the count right on election day. So I'm kind of concerned that, number one, the post office is all fouled up. Number two, if I do a permanent mail-in ballot, will my ballot be counted if it arrives after election day? So maybe I should just go back to regular voting. I mean, my precinct isn't normally that crowded, so I may just give that up and just feel that, at least if I get to the polling place, my vote will be recorded, and if I mail it in, it might not be.
Well, I don't know how things work in Pennsylvania. I do know Bob got a mail-in ballot for the last election, but we went to the polling place and cast our vote in person, and you just handed them the mail-in ballot that you had received.
Right.
And they took that and you were able to vote. So at least it left the option open, or you might just want to wait and see how the legislation evolves, before the next election, before you make a decision.
Right.
Well, another option is not to mail it. We took ours to media, to the courthouse, and placed it in the drop-in box.
Right.
Well, I did that too, assuming they're going to have drop boxes next time.
Well, yeah,
There was a big fight about drop boxes too, so maybe they
Yeah.
won't have the drop boxes.
that's
That's why I
true.
say you might just want to wait and see, wait
Yeah.
and see.
That's very true.
Well, and of course, all of this discussion at the federal level about the filibuster and about the need to act on HR 1. And so there's the question of eliminating the filibuster. There's also the question of exempting voting rights legislation from that instrument so that it could be addressed. Obviously, what's in HR 1 is designed to address at least the most egregious of the issues that have been plaguing us these last years.
What do you think the chance of passage in the Senate is? Is this
Depends
a straight?
on, well, if, I don't know. It seems, based on what I've been reading, that there is an opening developing to find a way to make that work. I mean, you're pretty hard pressed to say you don't want elections to be fair and open, but there are those who are more than willing to say that. So I'm an optimist at heart. I am hopeful that with advocacy, that with involvement and action and voices heard, that ultimately it will make a difference. I hope so, because I think absent that, with some of the legislation that's being proposed, what we've seen as issues up till now will be even more draconian going forward.
Yeah.
Oh, fingers crossed.
Rebecca.
Yeah. I know this is a little off subject, but in light of the terrible tragedy that happened in Georgia this week with the Asian Americans, I'm assuming that these racial issues, this voter suppression, probably applies to a lot of them as well. Certainly the current state of our affairs.
Yeah, I don't think there's the same, well, there clearly isn't the same history.
Right.
But I think the issues of discrimination and oppression on a range of factors continues. And so I'm sure there's an effect. You know, we extrapolate to gender, to race, to ability, disability. We're not terribly tolerant of those different than we.
Right.
Anyone else?
I think everybody wants to get back to the game.
Well,
Not everyone, not everyone. Not everyone. Just
well, I
saying.
want to thank everyone for being here. We have several people who have not been here before and for whom I do not have email addresses. So I'm going to ask, since I'm on my iPad and it's hard, I'm going to ask Sue to put into the chat my email address for those of you who aren't on our regular distribution. Joachim is one, and Pick and Sarah, if I can read that correctly, is another, and I think there was a third. If you want to if you want to see the recordings of the previous sessions and you want to get the announcement for the next session, please send me your email address, and Sue's going to put that up on the chat line.
Bob?
If you can.
Bob, which email address do you want?
You, Mitch. And I appreciate everyone being here, and Sue does too. Next week is a pivotal session, and it's the last session. And the topic is, where do we go from here? We've heard all of the history. We've heard a lot of the history, maybe not all of it, but we've heard a lot, and it sets a framework for what do we do. If we just say, okay, I watched all these videos and I'm going to go about my life, that's one thing, but that really isn't going to use the power of your knowledge now to affect change. And next week's session is all aimed at what do we do? So we look forward to seeing you all next week. Same time, same channel. Who knows whether Michigan basketball is going to be playing at the exact time. I hope they're playing, but who knows? And in any event, we will see you. Have a great week, and we will see you next week.
If I could just add one piece, I'll have materials about where do we go from here. But I would very much appreciate your thoughts on what action is needed and appropriate, and what commitments do you see that are ones that you would make, so that it will be a more interactive, engaging, involving dialogue. So please bring your thoughts next week as well.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank
Go
you.
Blue.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you so much.
Bye.
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 I was going to tell them, I'll send them an email that they